Europe in the Biden era. I am Si-en, your MC for today. We thank you for joining us in today's dialogue on China, the United States, and Europe in the Biden era. This forum is organized by World Scientific Publishing and named after the journal China and the World, Ancient and Modern Silk Road, to promote communication and exchange on China and BRI-related themes. A few housekeeping notes before we start. You are most welcome to leave your cameras on, but please keep your mics muted while the forum is ongoing. There will be a Q&A session after the talk. To ask questions, please either raise your hand through the Zoom reactions during the Q&A session. I will call on you and then you can unmute your mic and speak directly to the speakers regarding your question. Otherwise, you can also feel free to leave your questions in the Zoom chat throughout the dialogue, and I will read them out on your behalf during the Q&A session for our speakers to address. This webinar will also be recorded and posted online. Today, we are very pleased to have with us our special guests, Professor Zhiqun, Professor and Chair of the International Relations Department at Bucknell University, USA, as well as Professor Astrid Nordin, Lau Chair of Chinese International Relations in the Lau China Institute, King's College London. Our moderator for this event will be Professor Da Hsuan Feng, Honorary Dean of Hainan University Belt and Road Research Institute and Chief Advisor of the China Silk Road Eye Valley Research Institute. They will be the main speakers for the dialogue and will reply to Q&A during the session as well. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Professor Zhu, Professor Nordin, and Professor Feng.
Okay, thank you, Si-en, for this introduction. Well, friends, I think this morning or evening, as the case may be, we are hosting an important and timely dialogue about a geopolitical pas de trois. I really love this term that is introduced by Professor Zhu. I'm particularly impressed that in French, the S is
Sorry, Professor Feng, you're muted.
To start again. Okay, dear friends, sorry about forgetting to unmute myself. This morning or this evening, as the case may be for you, we are hosting an important and timely dialogue about a geopolitical pas de trois. I'm also impressing myself learning how to speak French. I just realized that in French, it's never pronounced the way it's spelled. This came about when the three of us realized that as many new and globally important issues were being put on the table during the recent G7 meeting held in Great Britain. In fact, indeed, that the particular G7 meeting was held in Britain allowed Europe to appear not just as a loose collection of many nations, but accentuated as an important amalgamated region of the world. In the pas de trois of the United States, China, and Europe. There is no doubt that interaction between Trois components are happening so rapidly from the subsequent G20 meeting, where the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi did not attend the meeting with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the visit of German Chancellors Angela Merkel with President Biden in Washington, D.C., and the video conference held between French President Emmanuel Macron, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Merkel, to the convoluted and complicated issues involving whether or not the US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman could visit China I just learned from Professor Zhu that even as we speak now, negotiations are still ongoing as to whether she would be coming to China or not. These complications tell you that the three groups dancing is carrying out in a very complex manner. Perhaps what is clear with all these ballet dancing is that there is no doubt that all three components are fully cognizant of how important one could or should find a way to collaborate for the betterment of humanity. With above as preamble, I'm very grateful that we have two experts here today to assist us to untangle and perhaps even unravel the web surrounding the issues. So let the show begins. I will first ask, as ladies first, Astrid to speak.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Feng, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. And I hope that we come out the other end with some new ideas and reflections in relation to our conversation. I think we'll have a number of questions that will structure our conversation. So to forefront what I think is really important about this pas de trois, I'd like to draw attention to the relational nature of this dance or interaction, where the steps, the actions, the movements of each player isn't just something that happens independently, individually of the other dancers, but of course that is something that is determined in relation to the other players and depending on an expression of identity of the given dancer. Now, what I think we've seen in the G7 meeting that you mentioned, and also in statements that came out from NATO a few days later, was a new kind of rhetoric that it wasn't obvious would come from the new Biden administration, that built in many ways on narratives already existing in the US and in Europe, but that also were a very clear response to narratives that have existed in China for a long time. And that was particularly a more overt expression of a contrast or a competition between some imagined Western or democratic set of identities, ideals and principles in certain opposition, at least, to an equally imagined Chinese identity and set of ideals. Now, this opposition between China and democracy, China and the US, has existed for a very long time in China, and many historiographers and students of China have criticized what used to be understood as a kind of impact response framework for understanding Chinese action. And simply put, there used to be a way of understanding China that understood all Chinese actions as really just responses to what Westerners were doing. And of course, this was a problematic way of denying agency to China. And I think what we've been seeing over the last few months since Biden came into power is really the flip side of that, where a lot of what is coming out in narratives and policies from the US are formulated as responses to what China is doing. So I'm sure that one of the policies or narratives that we will talk about today is the B3W, the Build Back Better World. Nice to see that China doesn't have a monopoly on clunky expressions for infrastructure projects in the world, which is of course supposed to be a response, it is said, to the Belt and Road initiative, 一带一路. So we're seeing a really interesting shift here where increasingly, I think, American policy and narrative is formulated as a response to Chinese narratives and policies. And I think this is something that's been foreshadowed for a long time in China. Now, where's Europe in all of this, of course? Well, Europe, just like the US and China, is formulating stories, narratives, and policies primarily for a domestic audience, right? So these global narratives about who China is in the world, who the US is in the world, and who Europe is in the world is told primarily to a domestic audience, whether this takes place in a democratic system or not. And in Europe, people are looking at a China that says that US is the imperialist baddie who has created national humiliation in China for a long time. In the US, we increasingly see narratives that portray China as this bad guy whose authoritarianism is going to suppress the world and undermine the good democracies that are portrayed in that story. Now from Europe, quite interestingly, in many places like my own native Sweden, China and the US are seen in very much the same way. They are both seen as imperialist powers. They are both seen as powers that are underpinned by strong nationalist, protectionist, often dirty play, right? And Europeans create an image of themselves as the good guys, the softer options, the ones that lead by example in this equation. Now, of course, not everybody else in the world accepts that position, but there are these three dances, these three stories that are all now formulated in relation to one another. And that's something that I hope that we will keep in mind as we continue our conversation today, is this mutual
let me just cut in a sentence here. Except in 1930, when Hitler was running Germany, that Europe was not the good guy.
Oh, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the case, but I think the Nazis as well portrayed themselves as the good guys, right? Many others in Europe would disagree with this, of course, as others elsewhere in the world. But I think all states, to an extent, do this, right? They tell a story to convince themselves that they have a goodness, a coherent narrative about who they are in the world, and that they are a force for good in the world. Now, the story about what is good differs in those stories, right? Few others in Europe would agree that the Nazi story about what the good looked like is one that they abide by. Equally, many disagree with the US image of what the good looks like, or the Chinese image of what the good looks like. But I think what they all share is this underpinning of a story where they themselves are the protagonists of the good fight, as it were.
Prof, I think you're muted.
Professor Zhu, you need to unmute.
Well, I thought they asked me to unmute. Anyway, I got it. Thank you very much. So yes, good morning, good evening once again. It's a great pleasure to be working with Professor Feng again, and also very glad to be sharing the panel with Professor Nordin for the first time. And congratulations on your new position at the King's. I'll be very brief for this opening statement. I guess we'll have to go into details with many questions we have prepared. The title, of course, is Part Trois. I think it's important to notice at the beginning that the world is not evolving just around these three players: China, United States, and Europe. There are other important players. I think we have to include, for example, Russia, Japan, and a lot of middle powers, including Australia, South Korea, for example, right? And some smaller powers as well. For example, Singapore, right? These are also very important actors in the international system. And of course, there are a lot of actions going on among the three major players we're talking about today. Just as Professor Feng mentioned, right after G7 summit, actually, President Xi of China held a virtual meeting with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron of France. So both the United States and China are trying to work with European countries to present their agendas, right? I think it's also important to note that the Chinese and Americans look at the relationship between them very differently. I think the United States portrays the competition between China and the United States as something between democracy and autocracy. So I think we need to challenge that assertion. Is that true? Is there really ideological competition here, or is something else, such as governance? Which system actually has is better prepared to handle a major crisis such as the COVID-19, right? I also want to note very briefly about the nature of U.S.-China relations. I mean, right now, I think most of us are pretty much, frustrated about the status of the relationship, because there's so much competition and even confrontation going on between the two sides. The incentive for cooperation is very weak, right? But I think actually competition is good. I think competition will bring out the best out of everybody, right? As they say, a rising tide raises all boats. So it's good. I look forward to actually seeing more competition between China and the United States and between China and European countries, because with this incentive, actually you can do better, right? But of course, the challenge is how to avoid confrontation while focusing on areas of common interest. That's a big challenge. In other words, can they still work together despite all the differences? Can they avoid a new Cold War, right? That's something that we need to examine today. I'll stop here, and I look forward to a more interesting dialogue ahead. Professor Feng, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I think those two really outstanding opening speeches by our two guests are good segues into the first question I have in my mind, and that is unquestionably one of the most eyeball-catching term that emerged from the G7 meeting is Build Back Better World, B3W. It's a mouthful, but it's okay. It becomes an iconic rhetoric of the G7 meeting as mentioned, for the Liberal Democratic Alliance to counter the Belt and Road Initiative of China. The genesis of this rhetoric was the phone call of Biden and Boris Johnson on March 26. The democratic countries should rival China's Belt and Road Initiative, as mentioned, as quoted by Biden. I believe that the tone of B3W in G7 is simply a solidification of Biden's comment after he became the president. And he said, and I quote, China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch, because the United States is going to continue to grow. Indeed, on April 29, Biden is again calling the United States as a country to be more competitive against a deadly earnest China. It must be intriguing for the global community to observe that the competing and confronting China is United States' strategic position now on just about everything it intends to do, including infrastructure, for example. So it would be, as scholars of geopolitics, perhaps it would be interesting for the two of you to go deeper into this issue of B3W, what is meant, and how this could impact the world in general. Thank you. Well, start, anyone, the two of you.
You want me to get started? Okay, I'll get ball rolling. All right. I think, as an alternative to the BRI, B3W is good news for developing countries, I would argue, because China has been very lonely recently in promoting global governance, global development in the past few years. I think right now the United States or G7 countries are imitating what China has been doing. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I think China should be happy that the United States and other countries are learning, are copying what China has been doing. As I mentioned, this imitation also introduces some dose of competition, which will help everybody actually. With more choices for low and middle income countries, they will have more opportunities to promote their growth. And with competition and choices, the infrastructure projects are more likely to be transparent, with less corruption perhaps. And these developed countries were also likely to work with different investors, foreign investors. So in that case, these investors from China, from the United States, from European countries, actually will be able to work together. And that will actually facilitate cooperation between China, United States, and Europe. But the challenge, of course, especially from the US side, I think we need to change this mentality, this zero-sum mentality, because B3W, was proposed as a challenger to a BRI, as if this is a game, a zero-sum game. I think that mentality has to be changed. I think, everybody involved here needs to change their attitude and engage in a win-win competition here. And of course, there are many challenges indeed. This B3W is only an idea, an ambition right now. I don't think we have any specific plans yet. For example, where will the money come from? Do G7 countries have the experience in developing the new infrastructure? Now remember, many of these countries actually have dilapidated infrastructure that needs to be updated themselves. I doubt they have the expertise in helping these other countries. And how sustainable will this initiative be? Now, in 4 years, remember, in 4 years, how many of these current G7 leaders will still be in power? And will their successors support this idea? So I don't think it's good time now to tell how the B3W will pose a serious challenge to the BRI. I think it's too early, too premature. I stop here.
Okay. Astrid?
Thank you, Professor Zhu, for those comments. Now, building on what you've said, first of all, I'd like to perhaps moderate a little bit this suggestion that China has somehow been the only leader or power interested in global development. I think what the BRI has done is specifically develop that through infrastructure, also through other things, but it's particularly infrastructure-led development that the BRI has encapsulated. Of course, we've had a kind of big setback from a number of major powers, the US and the UK included, in terms of leadership of development. But I would suggest that it's not the case that China has been kind of the only power interested in global development, but it's the only power that's been interested in a very particular kind of global development focused around infrastructure. Now, if we look 10 years back, there was a bit of a, I guess, self-contented European attitude and American attitude as well to development, where this was often seen as something that Europeans, Westerners, democratic states did. And there was a real neglect, I think, of infrastructure. And many of the development agencies in these countries in Europe and in the US have changed their approach to development, I think in direct response to Chinese initiatives. And in many ways, that's been a good thing. Now, the other thing I'd like to kind of pick up on, I guess, is your suggestion that we should seek a win-win situations. And of course, most states, most actors in international development portray what they do at something that everybody benefits from and nobody loses, at least nobody that we need to worry about. And I think that we need to be a little bit careful with this win-win rhetoric as well, because some win more than others under all political systems, under all political initiatives. And that's a political thing. It's a political thing, who wins more and who wins less. So I think we need to be a little bit careful with this win-win rhetoric. That doesn't mean falling back into a zero-sum rhetoric either, right? That's also a problem in many of these contexts. But this claim that states, including the Chinese state, make that their policies have no losers, that everybody wins, that it's good for everybody, I think is something we need to be a little bit suspicious of. Now, finally, my third point in relation to your comments, Professor Zhu, is about the benefit of competition. And in many ways, I agree with you on this. I think we've now got a rhetoric, part of this competitive rhetoric coming out of especially China and the US, is an attempt to say that they represent a better policy, a better system, a better set of values, and the Chinese party states' goals are formulated in direct competition in relation to the US, right? So their own goals are about surpassing the US in various different metrics, presenting a better alternative. And now we've seen very similar rhetoric coming out of the US as well. Now that can go in a bad way, that kind of competition where actors try to sabotage each other, where the competition is understood to mean denigrating, belittling, humiliating, or obstructing other parties. We've seen a lot of really nasty rhetoric of this kind coming out of both China, the US, and Europe as well. From China, the wolf warrior diplomacy is an example that's received a lot of attention, but we've seen very similar kind of rhetoric, of course, under Trump in particular, but also coming out of Europe as well. And I would suggest, and I imagine that Professor Zhu and I are on the same page here, that a better response to this perceived competition of systems is to put your money where your mouth is. You're correct, the B3W doesn't really mean that much yet. Neither did the BRI to start off with. It was started off as a relabeling of projects already underway. We might see something similar with the B3W, but if it doesn't go beyond that, if we don't see money coming out to back up this rhetoric, concrete initiatives coming up to back up this rhetoric, then of course few will be convinced that it provides a better alternative as Trump and others, or sorry, Biden and others would like to suggest. So in that sense, I'm also hopeful that perhaps those who are making these arguments, who are telling these stories, will see that nobody will believe those stories unless they translate into concrete action in terms of funding, transparency, anti-corruption, and delivering benefits to people in a real way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually very interesting to compare the initiation of the BRI and the initiation of the B3W in terms of timing. BRI started pretty much right after China's GDP surpassed Japan as becoming the second largest economy in the world, when it surpassed Japan. Whereas the B3W were really initiated in response to what's happening from BRI. So B3W has some response too, whereas BRI started because China at that point in time, in 2013, gained enough self-confidence that both economically and also geopolitically, that they have the confidence to do something. For example, I always argue, why didn't China do this, announce this in 1997 when Hong Kong reversed back in sovereignty to China? It would seem like a perfect time when Hong Kong is coming back and China is reaching out to the world. But I think in terms of its economy in 1997, China was nowhere near ready or able to start something as grand or as large as the BRI. So anyway, that itself is a very interesting perspective. Okay, let's go on. One of Harvard University's most well-known scholar, Graham Allison, wrote a book with the title "Destined for War: Can U.S., American, and China Escape Thucydides' Trap?" I would say that in the past several years, whenever the opportunity arises, he would push this thesis to the forefront. Essentially, he listed historical situation between an existing power faced with a fast rising power. The Thucydides trap, which is a war between these two powers, is inevitable. With that as an example, Allison cited were indisputable. There are certain ingredients which the US and China do not seem to fit that mold. The most important difference is that in all the historical examples, these countries do not possess nuclear weapons. That could unilaterally annihilate humanity several times over. In fact, even during the days of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, there was a MAD, or mutual assured destruction principle of deterrence, precisely for this reason. As the relationship between US and China continues to deteriorate, which it obviously seems to be, and the US leaderships, both in the White House, Congress, all assuming belligerent policies, should Europe, towards China that is, should Europe as a continent or as a region which experienced war devastation very, very badly in the 20th century, be a balance of this sanity in this possible conflict? Professor Zhu. You need to unmute. Okay.
So I got to answer the question first again. Well, just a quick comment on your remarks about the timing of BRI and B3W. I totally agree with you. I think, it's quite telling that nowadays it's China that is setting the global agenda. And also, everything Biden and the European leaders were talking about at G7 was about China, basically. And these European countries and American and the United States are basically compelled to respond, react, and come up with their own alternatives. So that's quite telling about the current international system and also in terms of international governance. I know Professor Nordin has a little difference with me here about agenda setting. But coming to the question about the Thucydides trap, I think it's no big deal. I mean, this idea, this so-called theory, is basically a rehash of the power transition theory in international relations. It's nothing new, But since it was coined by Allison, a big name Harvard professor, so this term gained traction and became popular. The Thucydides trap probably could explain what happened in the past, but I don't think it will be able to predict the future. As you, Professor Feng, mentioned, we are living in a nuclear age. I mean, any war between nuclear powers will be total catastrophe. And I hope that the war will not be on the menu of these great powers. I mean, they can definitely resolve differences through other means. Now, the role of Europe, you're right, Europe suffered from 2 world wars, and many countries in Europe are kind of stuck in the protracted competition between China and the United States. So it is reasonable to expect European countries to play some role. I agree with you. I think European countries can perhaps serve as a balancer or a bridge between the United States and China. I think the United States policy, in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration, has been way too confrontational with China. I think European countries share many concerns with the United States in terms of China's aggressive behavior, China's violation of human rights, a lot of issues, right? But I think European countries also prefer a more nuanced approach, a more balanced approach. And in that regard, I definitely think that Europe has the potential to be the kind of a sovereign player in this new Cold War, quote unquote, as temperature, continues to rise in both Washington and Beijing. So that's my hope. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I do hope that Europe will play an active role in cooling down the situation between China and the United States, and in helping avoid a new Cold War between China and the United States.
Right, should I pick up
Yes,
there then, perhaps?
yes, of course.
It will probably not be a surprise to those who've heard me speak so far, or who know any of my work, to know that I do not believe for a second that the future is determined. I think that this dance that we're talking about here, the stories that are being told, the identities that are mutually shaped by the actors involved, change over time and can change for the future. So rather than resort to ideas about Thucydides trap and Allison's book, I think we might reach for something like Alexander Wendt's "Anarchy is what states make of it" as a claim, right? So the structure of the international system does not, I believe, determine behavior. It might shape what makes sense given certain ideas about identities, who we are, and so on. But I certainly do not believe that there is a determinism there. I, for the same reason, don't believe that Europe's past makes it more able to address the issues at hand, more suited to mediate between China and the US, or indeed more responsible for doing so in some way. I think both China and the US also have plenty of domestic resources, terminologies, narratives, and historical example that can, if there is willing, be used to motivate positive action. Now, I am perhaps more pessimistic than Professor Zhu about states' ability or willingness to avoid total catastrophe. I think our collective failure to address the big climate change crises that I think we're seeing at the moment is an example that looming total catastrophe does little sometimes to motivate states into better behavior. Now, I also want to pick up a little bit. I can see questions coming in the chat, and one of the questions ties in quite nicely to what I've just been saying, so perhaps I can pick up on that. And this is from, I believe, Gustavo Alvarez, who asks about new political schools of thought in China, for example, the Shanghai intellectuals with neo-authoritarianism, representing a narrative on the democracy-autocracy clash. And he's asking, to which extent is there any possibility to reshape the democracy-autocracy debate between Western liberal democracies and China? And are there any academic projects that bring both US and Chinese political scientists together? So I would like to comment that, yes, there are projects like that. I myself am involved in a number of them around the kind of relational approach that I advocated in my kind of opening remarks to this talk. And that's one example of the kind of joint up thinking that I think can provide narratives with resonance both in Chinese history, society and rhetoric, and in European and American rhetoric. So, for example, the idea of a relational approach about connectivity as a primary assumption when we analyze the world has very strong foundations in, for example, yin-yang thinking, in Confucian and particularly Taoist traditions of thought. It resonates in a lot of traditional Chinese cooking and Chinese medicine and so on, where these concepts also exist. And equally, although some portray it as a resolutely Chinese way of thinking in opposition to the West and Western traditions of thought, there are plenty of intellectual resources for this type of thinking also in Europe. And I think that these kinds of alliances around shared rhetorical tropes, imagery, narratives, and conceptualizations might be a way of finding better ways to motivate us collectively to avoid the total catastrophes that we see on the horizon, be they climate catastrophes or indeed war and Thucydides. So plenty of scope to speak differently about our problems and thereby address them in a different register, I believe.
Just a quick comment here, if I may, Professor Feng.
Of course.
About this new so-called Shanghai school of new authoritarianism. I guess maybe people are talking about Eric Lee or Zhang Weiwei, those folks. I don't know whether it's already a school of thought in China. I mean, certainly they represent some people in China, right? But is that the mainstream thinking in China? I don't know. I doubt. But fundamentally, let me put it this way. Fundamentally, I disagree that U.S.-China competition is about democracy versus autocracy. I don't think that's that simple. I mean, I don't think there's ideological competition here. I mean, the United States is trying to promote democracy around the world. It's one of the fundamental foreign policy pillars of U.S. policy. So that's true. United States is actually exporting democracy, but China is not exporting anything, any ideology. China keeps telling developing countries like, look, you got to find your own way of development based on your own history and culture. China is not engaged in a ideological competition with the United States. So it's not a competition between democracy and autocracy. but I think, based on my understanding of Chinese policy and my interaction with Chinese scholars, they are talking about something different. They're talking about governance. They're talking about the ability to govern, ability to deliver, ability to set goals and achieve them. And they believe that in that regard, the Chinese system is more viable than the current democratic system right now, which is suffering from inefficiency, strongman leadership, populism, those kind of things. So the Chinese believe that whether the system works is not based on particular type of system, whether through election or not through election. They're looking at the results. It's results based. They look at the meritocracy of their leaders, whether these leaders are capable of keeping their promises and delivering the goods and helping people to raise living standards. In that regard, and we all know that democracy is wonderful, right? But democracy may also elect incapable, even terrible leaders. So that's kind of a debate going on in China, I think. But anyway, that's kind of internal debate. I don't think the Chinese scholars are saying that, look, our system is necessarily better than a Western system. So I'll stop here.
This is actually although we have other issues to talk about, but let me drill down a little bit more here. Instead of us thinking of my system or your system, the system that we should embrace or should promote is a system that can self-correct. And I think that in the last 4 years in the United States, we may have seen when a system cannot easily self-correct, what possibility it could have. And so probably the interesting question or $1 million question here for both of you is whether you agree with this concept, namely whether you call it democratic system or social system. If the system cannot self-correct, then not a very good system. What do you think from this point of view, Professor Zhu?
In terms of self-correction, I think you can argue that United States is self-correcting the policies of the previous administration. President Biden has reversed many of the policies of Trump. So the United States is doing some sort of self-correction now, right? In terms also returning to the international system, rejoining international organizations. So the United States is doing that, and we all know that democracy has that capability, and we should be proud of this living a democracy. But on the other hand, I think you can also argue that even the CCP in China also has self-correcting capabilities. You can make that argument. I know people may disagree here, right? You can cite all the terrible mistakes the party made in history, right? Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward. But the party also says that, look, we also corrected our mistakes. After 1978, we stopped all those political campaigns. We focused on economy. So that's also a kind of a self-correction. But I think the argument here is not whether a system can self-correct itself or not. I think they're talking about the freedom, how the society is governed, whether human rights fundamental human rights are preserved, those kind of things. Obviously China and the West have a huge gap here, right? And we can spend hours now talking about all those differences, and each side probably can come up with their own defense, but that's a huge problem here, I think, we're facing now.
Astrid?
Thank you. I think I'm a little bit puzzled by the question, because the idea of self-correction seems to imply that there is one thing that's correct. And I don't really see the world in that way. I see it as profoundly political, and perhaps this is what I was trying to get at with my comments on the win-win rhetoric earlier on as well, that we may speak of self-correction, but it seems to imply a return to something universally somehow appropriate or good or normal. And my suggestion would be that that doesn't really exist as such, but what we perceive as normal, correct, as a self-correction as opposed to an anomaly or something going wrong, is an effect of the stories we tell about different actions. And I think that's true both in a democratic system or an authoritarian or other kind of system. Now, in relation, if I may be indulged and allowed to return a little bit to our last question as well, I wanted to come back on the suggestion from Professor Zhu that we aren't talking about conflicting systems here. And I think he's correct in the sense that there is absolutely nothing determined about democracy and or a Western system or a Chinese system being in conflict, for example. There is no such thing as a perfectly democratic state or a perfectly harmonious state or a perfectly efficient state, and so on. So these are all ideals that different states strive for in different ways. But I do want to take issue nonetheless with this suggestion, because I think there are very explicit narratives in China, both from the Chinese government and from academic colleagues, that China is in direct competition with a democratic Western system of ideas, values, dominance, power that needs to be countered. We had a few years ago, for example, the infamous Document 9, which was a document that basically told various institutions not to talk about democracy, at least not in a positive way, right? Why would such a document exist if there was not a political perception of competition where democracy was a rival, a threat to be countered? And I'd like to also perhaps point to some colleagues whose ideas I admire greatly, who have inspired my own writing to a significant degree. For example, Zhao Tingyang, who writes about the virtues of a Qianxia system as a better and Chinese alternative idea of world order. Also, Qin Yaqing, who used to be the dean of Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, who's also a co-author of mine. We see eye to eye on many things. But his Zhongyong dialectic, which again draws on this yin-yang traditions of thought, is sold to the world as a better way of thinking based on Chinese traditions of thought, which is better than what he says is a kind of rationalist, Euclidean, Western way of thinking. So I think that there are certainly the same tendencies in both Chinese academia and politics and in both American and European academia and politics to perceive in many quarters this kind of opposites that are in competition, and where the system that is perceived as one's own is said to need strengthening in order precisely to overcome and win out over the rival system. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is everybody's view in either America, Europe, or indeed China. Certainly, many Chinese people will never have heard of Zhao Tingyang or Qin Yaqing or Document 9, right? And equally, it's not hard to find people in in Europe or the US who would suggest that indeed China does present a better alternative in these regards. So I don't really want to just let go of that idea of competition as something that is very, very real in both academia and politics, but as a narrative trope rather than as an inevitable future or structure to politics.
Well, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I think both of you have articulated your deep understanding of this quote unquote competition between the East and the West. I'd like to drill down even further on this, because I think this is something that we seldom talk about. And that is the competition of civilizations. For example, in May 2019, Hong Kong's South China Morning Post reported a speech by the American State Department's Director of Policy Planning. This is during Trump, I should add, Miss Karen Skinner. Miss Skinner is a former student of Condoleezza Rice, and also a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Miss Skinner is a member of the Brain Trust within the State Department during the Trump era. In this report, it says, and I quote, speaking about the challenge that the US perceives from China today, and I think she meant also not only just US, but maybe Western in general, a challenge that is broadly appreciated across from both major political parties. This is specifically about the United States, of course. Skinner traversed dangerous grounds. The fight with China, she said, was a fight with a different civilization and a different ideology, and the US hasn't had before. She added more controversially that China posed a particularly unique challenge as it represented, quote unquote, the first time that we will have a great power competition that is not Caucasian. These are indeed disturbing words uttered by someone representing the mindset of the United States State Department, at least during the Trump administration. I think here, again, Europe with a deep and long interactions, of course, some of that is through the colonial powers, with Asia and with East Asia. Now that we're in the Biden era, is there any way to perhaps repackage or reformulate these words coming from Ms. Skinner representing the State Department, at least during the Trump era? Let me start with Astrid.
Thank you. I think we're seeing an era of increasingly racialized narratives. We see a racialized logic of the state, of activities abroad, both in the US, in China, and in Europe. In my own little corner of the world, we've seen a really nasty edge of anti-Chinese rhetoric in the wake of COVID. That I think has been quite shocking in the very specific racist targeting of Chinese people. I think we see similarly racialized logic within China, sometimes in relation to white people. You know, when I go to China a lot of the time, my ideas are dismissed purely on the basis of my skin color, that I can't possibly understand China because I'm not Chinese. But we also see it, for example, in Xinjiang, in the camps that are targeting primarily Uyghur ethnic and Muslim populations, but other racialized minorities. as well. And of course, the US is a state that's built on racial oppression from the outset, right? So I don't think that that Europe has a unique, unfortunately, history dealing with extreme racialized violence. I think we see racialized violence in many parts of the world. And of course, empire has been a vehicle for the export of this kind of racism. So I would be delighted if Biden in power, and of course Kamala Harris as vice president, would do something to alleviate a racialized narrative in the US. I very much doubt that it will. I think we will see a continued racist narrative enveloping this kind of China as the enemy rhetoric. And I think ordinary people who appear Chinese will feel the violent edge of that racism. I think that in China, Han chauvinism will continue and will continue to have an increasingly violent edge towards particularly racialized Chinese populations. And I think that in Europe, we are also seeing increased racist narratives, of course, bound up in Brexit, bound up in all sorts of other narratives. So I wish maybe Professor Zhou has something positive and hopeful to say, because I feel really pessimistic about our current predicament, our current set of narratives. Now, these things often have a kind of pendulum effect, that there are backlashes against previous narratives and so on. And I'm sure that this is not a linear development into a determined future, but I am really pessimistic and saddened by the terminology that's being used and perhaps ramped up by unnuanced formulations of anonymized social media in the current climate. Professor Zhou, do you have something more hopeful to say to us?
I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. Coming back to Dr. Skinner's comments. By the way, Dr. Skinner received her PhD from Harvard. I think she was heavily influenced by the late Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, who really proposed this idea of clash of civilizations. By the way, also, actually Skinner and I both taught at Hamilton College in upstate New York, but at different times. I think it was very unfortunate, and really those remarks are disturbing, right? As you mentioned, especially she herself is a person of color, so her comments have been condemned by many, both in the United States and outside. And I think she made a mistake. First of all, she said this was the first time the United States is engaged in a competition with a non-Caucasian country. That is not true. For example, Japan was a competitor of the United States, 1970s, 1980s, and Japan is not a non-Caucasian country, right? But I think, not to defend her, right? But I think, from the US perspective, the competition with China has some ideological component. There's no doubt about it. As I mentioned earlier, many Americans see the world through this simple dichotomy of democracy versus autocracy. And Americans are enthusiastic about promoting democracy in the world. But of course, from the Chinese perspective, the competition is not about ideologies or any kind of, cultural conflict. It's about governance. It's about how each society is ruled, is governed, and what their visions of the world will be for the future, and how people can live in dignity, in a peaceful environment. I think those are the fundamental issues here. And am I optimistic? I think yes, a little bit, I guess, because right after Joe Biden came to office, I think a couple of months into his presidency, the United States actually passed this anti-Asian racism law. So it's, I mean, people may still do things or say things nasty about Asians, Asian Americans, right? But hey, it's illegal now. We have that law in place now. So, and people may be executed, for engaging in anti-Asian racism now. So in that regard, I think, we do see a progress, and I do feel hopeful that this racist sentiment will decline, and the comment about clash of civilization, I mean, we'll still have some market in the United States and elsewhere. But again, I respect the views of those people, but I don't think that's the fundamental problem we're facing now. I mean, we have to respect the differences, different cultures, different civilizations, but at the same time, how can we seek cooperation? That's the biggest challenge, and in that regard, actually, I'm less optimistic. I think this the dominant West, led by the United States, seems to be determined to push back anything China does, seeing China's rise as a challenge, not just economic, political, military, but also as an ideological challenge. I think that's very dangerous, and I hope that that kind of thing can change. Maybe not so easy, but returning to this win-win concept, I noticed that some commentators also left some comments in the chat room. I think yes, win-win. it's almost impossible, for any project, to win equally for the parties involved, right? So when China says win-win, some people will laugh at it, right? Are you talking about China winning twice, right? Win-win, and others will not win at all, right? I mean, some people will think that, but I think, instead of quantify the what you win, I think it's the concept that through cooperation, everybody will be better off, That's the concept I think we should support, That's the win-win I support. I'm not saying that everybody will win equally in this competition. That's impossible, right? We cannot quantify it. But this mentality is important, Through cooperation, everybody will be better off. Because the alternative is conflict, fighting with each other. And what will be the outcome, right? Which one do you prefer? That's why I personally prefer win-win. Right, and of course, in some aspects, one party may win too much, right? Like China winning too much, maybe, in some projects, right? But that's a problem easier to fix than a war, I guess, right?
Well, I think that let's have one more issues in the discussion, and before we go to the audience for their participation. I think the discussion so far has been very exciting and very in-depth. We all know that, again, let's get back to the issue of the Pas de Trois. One of the important components of the three we mentioned is Europe. And it depends on how you define Europe, for example. I have a good friend who grew up in Uzbekistan, educated in Moscow, and now lives in United States as a very well-known physicist. He told me that, generally, even though at least half of the landmass of Russia is in Asia, Russians think of themselves as Europeans, quote unquote Europeans. They have the European mindset. And I think that is right, at least certainly from the Russians or the Eastern European, or the Russians that I have met. And it would be interesting, therefore, to see what Russia as a European nation in the Trois dance play a role. After all, the relationship between Biden and the Russian president has not been that good. Very harsh words were used by Biden about Putin, and how Putin immediately pulled the Russian ambassador out of China, out of the United States. I would like for both of you to comment on the role of Russia today, which is both European and Asian as well, or Eastern Asia as well, about this Trois. And let me start with Astrid.
Thank you. So maybe I should start with a disclaimer that Russia is really not at all my specialism. So perhaps take my comments with a pinch of salt. But I think in Biden's efforts to position China as this main adversary in the story that he's telling, he's been really, and he is really reliant on allies, primarily, but not only, European countries to come into the fold and align with his foreign policy preferences, and with this kind of two pole structure that he is narrating. And in doing so, I think he signaled that he is trying to stand up and be critical of Russia as part of this authoritarianism that he claims that the US is taking on together with democratic allies elsewhere. But in doing so, he's also been forced to prioritize China as the key problem and show readiness to compromise around Russia. So an example of this, for example, that he's waived sanctions on the company that's building this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, on which Germany is likely to rely on gas from Russia. So I think what that example perhaps signifies is a weakening of the resolve to counter authoritarianism in its Russian guise in order to enable the alliance with Germany to counter or at least stand up in relation to China. So perhaps Russia figures a bit uneasily for Biden. Of course, these stories that are being told, again, are told primarily for a domestic audience. And he's trying to get his policies through a US political system where he is espousing certain narratives to get Republicans on board, to get specific domestic communities, lobby groups, and so on board. But so Russia sits in that space as a kind of a baddie in the authoritarian camp, but one that he perhaps tolerates more, enables more, because of his perceived need to position this alliance of democracies in opposition to China. For China, Russia is, of course, very useful as an old friend, as Xi Jinping recently, him and Putin recently portrayed one another in a press conference, a joint press conference. And I think the existence of Russia and Putin's continued kind of mockery of Western or democratic or American hypocrisy, European hypocrisy, feeds in very nicely into the argument that democracy is only one system amongst many. China is not some crazy outlier here, but has authoritarian friends elsewhere, and of course possible trading partners and allies who will not criticize what a lot of Chinese leaders will consider or portray to be Chinese domestic affairs.
Professor Tu?
I think, Russia and China are coming together, not because they have shared values, it's really based on their shared grievances or complaints about the West, about the United States in particular. I think, Russians and the Chinese think that Western, especially American criticism of their policies towards Crimea, or Ukraine, or Tibet, Xinjiang, are sort of interference in their internal affairs. So they're not happy, And the role of Russia today is like the role of China during the Cold War, I would argue. It's deja vu. It's a story of two great powers seeking assistance of a third party in a global competition. So right now, both China and the United States are trying to curry favor with Russia, just like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger are trying to form a united front with China against the Soviet Union during Cold War. Today, Biden is trying to curry favor with Putin as US-China rivalry intensifies. I think Biden was trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China. But of course, the Russia-China relations are pretty strong because Putin and Xi are both strong leaders. Actually, both have modified the constitution so that they can stay in power indefinitely. They do share something in common, right? And also, shortly after Biden and Putin summit, Putin and Xi met virtually and reaffirmed their personal bond and close ties between the two countries. So apparently, Biden's strategy did not work in terms of dividing, Russia and China. By the way, actually, the United States probably took a page from China's playbook in terms of adopting this united front strategy. I mean, we all know in modern Chinese history, the CCP and the Kuomintang actually formed a united front twice to deal with bigger enemies, right? First against the warlords, and then against the Japanese. And united front is a strategy that the CCP continues to use today. So it's interesting to note that the Biden administration is copying this united front strategy in its foreign policy. And of course, Biden also copied the BRI, right, as we mentioned earlier. So that's something fascinating for me to notice that the United States seems to be lacking creativity now in its foreign policy, especially in dealing with China, and they're taking some strategies from China to counter China. That's been very interesting for me. Anyway.
Well, of course, in Chinese history, there's a famous book called the 三国演义, where the three parts of China constantly forming alliance between the two in order to conquer the third, and so on. I think we have reached a point in time that we should have a few comments, a few questions from our. So, Zhian, could you read some of the questions that has come through the chat room or wherever?
Sure.
Or if
Thank you,
anybody wants
Professor.
to raise their hands and ask questions in person, that also is okay.
Yes, so as Prof. Feng has said, please feel free to raise your hand via the Zoom reactions if you would like to ask your question directly. But perhaps while our audience are collecting their thoughts, I can just read out some questions that we have from the Zoom chat. So one of the interesting questions that we have comes from S. Mahmoud Ali, and they ask, would it be reasonable to suggest that as the post-Soviet order's systemic primate within a unipolar systemic core, the US has been determined to sustain its unipolar systemic primacy? So they refer to the defense planning guidance as well as China's identification as a constant competitor. And is it possible that what we see today is the culmination of that process whereby China's rapid growth and willingness to deploy its expanding capacity afflict the US with what they call displacement anxiety? So perhaps you can have your thoughts on that. US and displacement anxiety.
Well, Professor Zhu first.
Well, it's a good question about the international system, you know. So yes, we all know that after Cold War, United States has been the dominant as the unit, you know, the only superpower in this unipolar system. And the question is, how long can this system sustain, you know? And of course, rise will challenge that the system. You know, it doesn't matter actually whether China will intentionally challenge the system or not. The rise of China itself will challenge the unipolar system. And that's why I think the United States will do everything possible to prevent that from happening. You know, the United States obviously wants to stay on the top. You know, United States cannot tolerate any challenge, either from a potential enemy or even from allies, right? That will topple its global leadership. That's not tolerable for the United States. That has been very clear in terms of U.S. foreign policy, right? So now here's the situation. You know, China continues to rise, and China's power parity with the United States continues to narrow. It's over GDP. China's GDP is over 70% of US GDP now, right? And of course, in purchasing power parity, China's economy is already larger than US economy. So that, I mean, will the world moving towards a new bipolar system with the United States and China competing at the top? I mean, that's something. I don't know. I mean, it looks like it's happening now, right? It's not there yet, but it looks like it's emerging on the horizon. So pretty soon we're going to see two superpowers and many great powers in the system, which will be different from what we see now. Now is one superpower, many great powers, including China, right? But very soon, maybe we're going to see two superpowers competing with each other, and followed by many great powers. And can the United States and China manage that new power structure peacefully? That's the fundamental question. And we don't know what's going to happen. You know, we hope that the United States and China will be able to manage this power transition peacefully. And I think it's encouraging, actually. We mentioned the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, who is visiting Japan right now, go to China as well, towards the end of her Asia visit. I think in Japan, she also said that, you know, US-China relationship is very difficult. It's a multi-faceted relationship, but the United States will try to manage the relationship responsibly and constructively. So even the United States apparently is trying to avoid the Cold War with China. So again, as usual, I'm cautiously optimistic about the future, but it's not easy. All right. Thank you.
Astrid?
I'll be very brief because I see that we have hands up from people who want to come in as well.
Right.
And I'll say, yes, I think displacement anxiety is a real thing here. I don't tend to think about this as a question of polarity, but certainly a situation where the US self-identity as a state, as a public narrative, is so bound up in primacy, city on a hill and all of that, and equally Chinese narratives are very bound up in primacy, and neither really makes much space for the possibility of a sense of self outside that sense of primacy, and both states are explicitly focused on shaping international institutions, rules of the game or absence thereof, to facilitate what they see as their own national interests. So certainly displacement anxiety, I think, is a real thing. I'm going to think more about that in something I'm trying to write at the moment. So thank you for throwing that into the mix.
We have one person with his hands up. Is Mr. Alexandra Parini? Is that right?
Yeah, that's me. Thank you so much for.
Can you tell us who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. My name's Alexander Parini. I'm a lecturer at Trois University in Ho Chi Minh City, but I'm originally from the US.
Ah, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. One thing I'm wondering about, and so we discussed this idea of narratives. And so there's kind of this big narrative building in the US of democracy versus authoritarianism. But of course, the US is interested in strengthening ties with countries that might be considered authoritarian, such as Vietnam or Cambodia. So do you think this narrative could intervene with the United States trying to strengthen bonds with more authoritarian countries?
Astrid, do you want to start?
I'll leap on that one. That's a really excellent question. Thank you. Perhaps not as much as one would think, on the basis that a lot of domestic US debate might not really care about these smaller states, right? So in order for it to matter whether these states are democratic, authoritarian, or something else, the story of their being that needs to be part of a kind of public narrative. So most states are perfectly happy and able to pursue contradictory policies, right? To take two states that are perhaps equally authoritarian and say, okay, well, we need to ally with these guys and we need to oppose these guys. So we're going to pick on the authoritarianism of one state, but not on the authoritarianism of the other. With the other, we will engage based on a narrative of being helpful and aiding, being allies, of all sorts of narratives. You probably know better than I what those narratives are in that particular context. But so my suspicion is that unless the non-democratic nature of these states and these support given by the US comes to a more public debate, they do not threaten to undermine that American self-image in a wider population, and therefore they are likely to have less effect perhaps on policy formulation by state actors. I hope that answers your question.
Professor Tu?
Very quickly, Alexander, that's a good question. I think, critics of US policy will easily point out that it's double standards. It's a selective treatment of different authoritarian regimes. I mean, people often cite Saudi Arabia as a good example, right? Saudi Arabia is a key ally of the United States in the Middle East. It's an authoritarian regime, that violates many basic human rights. Yet the United States never says anything about Saudi Arabia. And then the United States always focuses on China. Everything's about China, right? So I mean, again, you can come to your own conclusion, but I think the critics will say yes, it's double standards. And I agree with you that the Americans need to engage in more debate on U.S. foreign policy. What's the fundamental principles of U.S. foreign policy? If we are really against the authoritarianism, or if it's something else, right? So those are issues that we cannot resolve here, I guess.
Yeah, this is really a very good question, because my home country or hometown, which is Singapore, how to define Singapore, whether it's authoritarian or whether it's democracy, I remember very clearly that Singapore's Lee Hsien Loong Prime Minister said that his country will not join any alliance that does not have China as a member. So it's very clear that these smaller countries are having many thoughts. They're not even second thoughts. There are many thoughts about Biden's views. We have another one. Let's Veronica Hui. I think you have to be the last one, because I think we're running out of time. So quickly, be succinct in your question.
Okay, Veronica here from Malaysia. Currently, I'm actually doing my second master's on the topic of the rivalry of the US, Europe, and China on the over solar energy field in ASEAN countries. So I actually would like to also comment what Dr. Zhu has said already, which is I find it is unfair that US has been targeting China over human rights issue, because US itself has a lot of human rights discrimination in the country. And coming to the energy policy, I actually find that the US and Europe is actually relatively weak in carrying out the energy policy, the energy diplomacy, because of the weak financial situation compared to China.
Okay, now let's have Professor Zhu first. Again, we're running out of time, so perhaps be concise in your answer.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the comments, but it's not a question, actually, So I think we do have another question from Henry Chan. Do you think we have time to let him ask?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Astrid, do you have a comment about Veronica's comment?
Okay, very quickly then, I think that going down the route of whataboutism, well, what about you, is not so helpful. If you're interested in this question, there's some excellent articles published online. You can just Google whataboutism on Google Scholar or something that might be some food for thought. But I think that the key point that I take from you that I wholeheartely agree with is that claims are not credible unless you live up to them at home, right? Like we started perhaps our conversation by saying, put your money where your mouth is, put your values where your mouth is. If you want to advocate democracy in the world, be democratic. If you want to advocate equality in the world, ensure that you pursue equality both in your domestic policies and in your policies with other countries. So live your values, I think, is a very perhaps good point to conclude towards.
Good.
Important
Henry
point.
Chen, go ahead. Are you still there, Henry Chen?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, my question is this.
I don't see your face.
Oh, yes, okay. My question is this. It seems that in the conversation tonight, there's no talk over the Taiwan issues, which is actually to the many Chinese, this is the core of the conflict between the US and China, rather than ideology. So can the speakers comment on this Taiwan issue's importance in the overall US and China relationships?
I think we will have to have another session for this particular question, but be that as it may, we have a few seconds for each speaker to comment on. Professor Zhu?
I mean, I think both the United States and China realize that the Taiwan issue is the most difficult one between the two sides. despite the many challenges in other aspects, trade and ideology even, right? But there's no easy solution here. I think China is adamant about reuniting Taiwan. I think Xi Jinping has set this as a goal for the Chinese, the revival of Chinese nation, right? And Taiwan has to be, he said, Taiwan has to be unified. And there's no way that Taiwan can become independent. And officially, of course, the United States does not support Taiwan independence. But I think it's in the US interests to keep Taiwan separate from China. Let's be frank. So the United States, I think, will try to do everything possible to keep Taiwan and China separate. So you have a situation here, right? China as a growing power, becoming more and more powerful, and will do everything possible to take Taiwan back. The United States, on the other hand, the current hegemon, will do everything possible to keep Taiwan away from China. So a conflict is on the horizon. Not any easy solution. And on this particular issue, Professor Nordin, I'm very pessimistic, actually.
Okay.
Well, maybe I'll chip in with some optimistic concluding remarks then. And although I agree with what Professor Zhu has said, I still hold out some hope that Xi Jinping has increasingly invested in this narrative that I keep banging on about, where China is supposed to be the better and benevolent leader of a better world order that embraces multiplicity and so on. Now, there is no way that you can, in any remotely credible way, today portray an incorporation of Taiwan into the PRC as anything other than conquest. Reunification is not going to come close to being accepted as a narrative for what would have to be a hostile takeover by the PRC. So my best hope for pushing the conflict into the long grass and perhaps over time developing other narratives where CCP rule is less reliant on the idea of incorporation of Taiwan, is that the CCP, the party state, understand how much a takeover of Taiwan, which would have to be a outright conquest, would harm this narrative that they are trying to pursue of not invading others and respecting others' self-determination. So that's the best thing I've got, the closest thing I've got to hope in that area.
Well, you know, I lived in Taiwan for 7 years. And during those 7 years, that were the Ma Ying-jeou time or the KMT time. And I actually saw palpably the two sides are getting, quote unquote, closer together in terms of interactions, in terms of having more students exchange, faculty exchange, and even business exchange. More and more Taiwan business are engaging significantly in the mainland. Unfortunately, in the last since the Minjindang has taken over the power, that sort of relationship is deteriorating very, very quickly. Only because at the current manner, the Taiwan government refuses to accept the so-called 9-2 common understanding, 9-2共识. And so I think that as United States has such tremendous influence in Taiwan, they could easily, if they want to, persuade or even force the current Taiwan government to engage in a discussion with the mainland by, for example, accepting in some form the 9-2 common understanding. And that itself would open up a lot of opportunities from my perspective. Okay, well, I think that we're down to the last question, and this is from Mr. Ghulam Ali. Please make it your question very, very brief, and say who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Ghulam Ali. I am from Pakistan. I've been working as a teacher in a Chinese university, and I am based in Taipei for near 1.5 years before the pandemic. My question is how you see this geopolitical rivalry expanding to South Asia, where India, given its geography, a rough parity with China, and above all, India's own hostility with China seemingly is ready to take side, while Indian Ocean is one of the most sensitive point for China. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Zhu, a 30-second answer to that question.
I feel like we need another session on this particular issue.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think in the India and China, I mean, if you look at the relationship, overall relationship, you know, again, you have areas of differences, but also many areas of common interest. I think right now, it looks like the media, the two governments are focusing on the differences, especially the border issue, right? But if you look at the relationship from other perspective, India and China as two largest developing nations, both have, rich civilizations, both need development, you know. From that big picture, you know, I think obviously India and China can and should cooperate. And India, of course, is a member of this non-alignment movement. I don't think India will necessarily pick sides in this China-US competition or rivalry. And India should not do that, actually, you know. And I hope that the India and China will find more common interests, you know, to focus on domestic issues instead of getting unnecessarily entangled in this international conflict.
Astrid, 30 seconds.
Very briefly then, I think India might be a headache for China, particularly because the BRI there has been spun, perceived, narrated as a violation of Indian sovereignty. And of course, this is a narrative that the Chinese government does not want to be built around, because its whole narrative about being the better alternative hinges on the claim that it supports, respects sovereignty of other states. So it might be a headache for that reason.
I cannot help but want to state two things. A, I was born in India, so India meant a lot to me. Secondly, in 1946, January 20th, India's to be the new Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, said to my father, Paul Feng, that if India and China hold together, the future of Asia is assured. So with that, we shall end today's session. And I want to thank everyone who stayed on for more than 90 minutes of this very, very interesting session. And I hope that I'm sure we're going to have a lot more of these sessions in the future. I know World Scientific is very enthusiastic about promoting them. So thank you very much, everyone. Zhian, you have anything to say finally?
Just that, yes, as Prof. Feng has said, thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us throughout the session, as well as the very excellent questions that we have received. We also want to thank our speakers, Prof. Zhu and Professor Nordin, as well as our moderator, Prof. Feng, for the very informative dialogue that we had today. So just in closing, please be welcome to submit papers or subscribe to the journal that this forum is based on, China and the World, Ancient and Modern Silk Road. More information can be found in the chat. So we thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you and farewell. And we'll see each other soon again.
Thank you, everybody.